dear guests, esteemed members of the diplomatic corps, media, dear panelists and participants. Welcome to the joint US-Europe Alliance and International University of Sarajevo conference on Biden administration's Bosnia policy, 30 years since the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina was formed. It is my great pleasure to see you all here in this historic venue to discuss this very important topic 30 years after the Clinton administration helped stop the conflict between the Army of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Croat Defense Council, the HVO, which led to the formation of the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The engagement of the Biden administration has arguably been the most active since the formation of the Federation. And we at USCA and IUS have brought together experts from both sides of the Atlantic to discuss Biden's Bosnia policy, including the place of human rights in this policy. We're going to have 3 terrific panels. The first 2 panels will be in English, so the working language of the conference is English. The third panel is going to be in Bosnia. We will kick off today's conference with a keynote speech by, I might say, safely say legendary Daniel Serwer, who served, I know he's not going to like compliments, but I have to, it's your day, Dan, who served as State Department's Special Envoy for Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1994 to 1996. Now, I met Daniel Serwer 17 years ago in Washington, and I have never stopped bothering him since, with questions, requests, and so on. And it's really hard for me to identify anyone else in Washington who has advocated, if not fought tooth and nail for Bosnia's democracy, stability, prosperity, than Dan Serwer. Whether in public service, and he was, as he often says, American diplomat who most frequently visited Sarajevo in the mid-1990s, or as a private citizen, which he is now as professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Dan has maintained his commitment to helping realize Bosnia's potential, whether it was at the top of American news headlines or otherwise. And I firmly believe this, Dan. He deeply cares about Bosnia, the region as well, also our families and communities, since I've gotten to know him very well personally as well. And that I have been able to assemble together with IUS, all of you here today, not only to hear his perspective, but his wisdom makes me very, very happy, honestly. And then it has honestly been an honor for me to work with you and always will be. Thank you for being you. Daniel, please.
I'm not as tall as Listen, it's a great pleasure to be back in Sarajevo. Truly one of the most beautiful and welcoming cities on earth. Yes, I was the embassy's most frequent visitor during the war, and a great deal has changed since I first arrived in '94. I want to remind people of what the city was like, not because you don't remember, but because we need reminders now and again. The streets were empty of both cars and people. The city was divided and isolated from the so-called suburbs. Shelling was frequent. Most shops were closed. Heat and electricity were at best sporadic. I find people often forget that there were no telephones. To make an appointment, you had to go see somebody. to make the appointment, then go back for the appointment itself. Civilians needed to learn where they could walk without being targeted by snipers. Thousands were killed. Small arms fire hit my plane during its landing on my first visit here. Things really have changed enormously. And my compliments to those who've made it happen. I find even in the last few years, Sarajevo much enlivened, younger, and more cosmopolitan. It's good that there are so many tourists crowding the streets these days. It's good that you have a Sarajevo School of Science and Technology that grants British as well as Bosnian degrees. It's good that the city hall is not only restored but occupied by a young woman who has more experience as a university professor than as a politician. But it's also true that the Dayton agreements froze the warring parties in place by institutionalizing the political divisions among Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, at least at the political level. I don't find that division much institutionalized in the daily interactions of the citizens, but at the political level, those divisions are frozen in place. Each group has a veto on almost everything at the state level and in the federation. Dayton also reduced the role of people who refuse to identify themselves as one of the three major groups, preferring to think of themselves as individuals with inalienable rights. I think it's high time to correct those mistakes. The two entities are the warring parties of 1995. One is now threatening secession. The other is threatened with division by those who want third entity. These objectives are ethnic war by political means. That's better than war by military means, but it's still not the best option available. You'll later in this conference discuss the legal strategy aimed at reforming Dayton, Bosnia, which has been notably successful at the European Council, the European Court of Human Rights, but remains largely unimplemented due to ethnic nationalist vetoes. The legal strategy should not, however, be the only strategy aimed at making Bosnia a more functional and effective state. Others may talk today about economic strategies. Any Bosnian enterprise with ambition should be unhappy with today's Dayton, Bosnia. A serious company should want a more unified economic space with improved relations with the rest of the world, especially Europe, but also the United States. But what I want to focus on mainly is political reforms, which I think are needed in two dimensions. One is reform within Bosnia's political parties, which are largely fiefdoms of the party leaders. More competitive contests for party leadership would open up the existing political parties, enable them to have more policy and programmatic focus, and reduce the dominance of the parties within the Bosnian state. And by doing that, it would reduce the risks of state capture by people exploiting public resources and patronage, and it would reduce the risks that state investigations of corruption would be blocked. So that's one dimension, reform of the political parties, away from being personalized political parties based on ethnic identity. Major political parties, that is. The second dimension of needed political reform is cross-ethnic cooperation. This is not entirely lacking. Croat and Serb ethnic nationalists cooperate quite well these days, as they did in southern Bosnia during the war. But what I think is needed is creation of a more civic-oriented multi-ethnic coalition, one that would reinforce the legal strategy that has produced such good results at the ECHR. Such a civic coalition would focus on improving governance, not only at the national level, but also in the municipalities. That's where the citizens and government interact most frequently, at the municipal level. A coalition that proves it can meet citizen demands at the municipal level will have a much greater chance of winning at other levels. Despite my wartime role as Gospodin Federacije, I am no longer a friend of the entities or the cantons. It seems to me Bosnia and Herzegovina could be more effectively governed at the municipal level and at the state level. The state government should have full authority to negotiate and implement the European Union acquis communautaire. The municipalities, in accordance with the European principle of subsidiarity, should have responsibility for everything else. But it's not clear to me how you get to that kind of post-Dayton Bosnia from where things stand now. It will take political courage and smart strategy, beginning with the redefinition of Bosnians as citizens rather than ethnic groups. Yes, you are correct in thinking that the Americans imposed the Dayton system on Bosnia. Some of you will want to fix what the Americans broke. We imposed what the wartime leaderships said they would accept. It wasn't only our invention. 29 years later, neither the Americans nor the Europeans have the clout to change the system in Bosnia. Nor do they have the incentive to do so, I hate to say. Many fear instability, and some have confidence in the transformational power of the EU, despite a lot of evidence to the contrary. I'm afraid it is now up to Bosnians to take the initiative to change the political system. There are good legal, political, and economic reasons to do so. The simple fact is that Dayton will not be able to join the European Union or NATO in its current configuration. That is, Bosnia will not be able to join NATO or the European Union in its current configuration. Many in the current political leaderships know that, but don't mind. They fear their own political and economic fortunes would end in a Bosnia with strong judicial, legislative, and executive institutions. It's Bosnia's citizens who are going to have to do the heavy lifting. The Europeans and Americans should be prepared to help. Sometimes I'm told that the Americans and Europeans have never really tried. And that's not really true. The Americans tried with European support in 2006 when they conducted the negotiations or supervised the negotiations over what became known as the April package. And I can assure you that the negotiations were really among Bosnians. They were actually conducted in the Bosnian language, even in Washington. I observed those negotiations at the time. I was responsible in the U.S. Institute of Peace for the conduct of that activity, which Don Hayes actually ran. So the April package came to the Bosnian parliament and failed to get a two-thirds majority in parliament by just 2 votes. We can discuss later why it failed. I don't think it was only the two votes. The EU has tried more recently, with American support, through the Citizens' Assembly, municipal versions of which, if I understand correctly, have also been convened in Banja Luka and Mostar. Much more of this kind of effort is needed to build a cross-ethnic constituency for peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But let me turn now to the hard part. It's hard to do, but it's also hard to talk about. I regret to say that Bosnia needs to be ready for war. Not because I wanted to go to war, but because I wanted to keep the peace. Milorad Dodik and Aleksandar Vučić have made their intentions very, very clear. They are creating a de facto Serbian world that would eventually remove Republika Srpska from any oversight by Bosnian institutions, judicial, legislative, or executive. This is actually a clever scheme, with each step kept below the level at which to stimulate a negative European or American reaction. So far, it's been mostly at the political level that this effort is conducted. But I wouldn't rule out a military dimension to this strategy for the Serbian world. Like the attempt at Banska in Kosovo last September, or a provocation intended to provoke a reaction that enables Republika Srpska or Serbia itself to justify intervention. The Bosnian Army, EUFOR, and NATO also need to be ready for what we call in Washington the little green men. The kind of operation the Russians conducted in Crimea, used to invest perhaps Britschko in a kind of stealth takeover. Only if Dodik and Vučić understand that there will be a rapid and effective US and EU military reaction can we be sure that they won't try these Moscow-inspired gimmicks. Preserving the peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina still requires both military strength, and it certainly requires also political reform. Getting beyond the Dayton state will require commitment and even inspiration. Bosnia's come a long way in 29 years. But it still has a way to go before it is a normal democratic country, one without a high representative. Yes, I do believe that that should be the goal. One whose unity and territorial integrity citizens of all ethnicities defend, and one in which individual rights are seriously protected for everyone. I'm fond of telling people that I wouldn't trade my individual rights as a minority, because I am a minority in the United States. I wouldn't trade my individual rights for group rights at all. Why? Because my individual rights are reasonably well protected by the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches, not only of the US government, but of state and local governments as well. That's the kind of Bosnia I would wish would be created here, and I wish Bosnians well in the worthy effort of creating a post-Dayton Bosnia, one that can join the European Union and NATO without looking back. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome everyone to this significant conference. I would like to welcome you on behalf of International University of Sarajevo, IUS. So the theme of our conference is particularly disturbing, as Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, finds itself at a critical juncture. Many citizens feel forgotten and betrayed by the international community. This sense of disillusionment is most acutely felt in perceived stances of the United States towards our country in the recent years. There is a widespread confusion and disappointment over the American policy, which appears to support nationalistic politics in Bosnia. This is exemplified by the backing of Dragan Čović and his HDZ, whose policies echo the divisive and harmful strategies of the past. This perceived international weakening of Bosnia with the help of some US policymakers raises a critical question that demands answer. Why has American policy shifted in a way that seemingly strengthens nationalistic forces to the detriment of Bosnia and Herzegovina? Bosnia and Herzegovina's unity and progress, above all. This stance not only undermines our state's institutions, but also fosters an environment ripe for malign influences from autocratic states such as Russia and China. A stronger Bosnia with robust state institutions is our best defense against the external threats. It is imperative that these concerns are conveyed to Washington. We believe there are still many within the American administration who are committed to a strong and united Bosnia and Herzegovina. We hope that today's discussion will resonate beyond this room and reach those decision makers who can influence change. As we embark on this conference, I encourage each of you to actively participate in the discussions, share your insights, and collaborate on finding solutions to the challenges we face here in Bosnia. Your expertise and engagement are vital to shaping a better future for Bosnia and Herzegovina. So thank you all for being here, and I wish everyone a successful and productive conference. Let us work together to ensure that our voices are heard and that our concerns are addressed for the benefit of Bosnia and its people. So I would like to welcome Reuf Bajrović and Jasmin Mujanović to take their place. So, and Ismet as the moderator or the first part of the panel. So floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, so this is the red button. So thank you all very much. Yeah, it works now. Yeah, sorry. So I'm going to try to be as direct as possible and as brief as possible. So the idea of the conference is to look at retrospectively at the last 30 years, and I've actually looked a few days ago as in preparation for what I was to say here at where Bosnia was in 94, 95, and where it is today. And then I took some of the key indicators, success indicators of different indicators that would tell us where Bosnia is today compared not only to the neighborhood but to the world. So post-Dayton BiH right now in 2023-24 has a Human Development Index of 0.78, which is considered a high, almost very high human development score. Has low, comparatively, very low levels of violent crime. Has a life expectancy of over 75 years, average life expectancy, which is better than several EU states. So there's, I think, 5 EU states where people tend to live shorter lives than they do in Bosnia. It has better global peace index score than France or Cyprus, so 2 EU member states. Its average economic growth in the last 29 years has surpassed European average almost every year. But if you compound it, it's fairly better than EU average growth. And I see former central bank governor who has joined us in the meantime, Mr. Softic, nodding in approval. So this is an interesting fact. Unemployment in Bosnia right now is at 13%, 1-3. It is the lowest unemployment rate ever. So unemployment rate in 1991 was 16.9, I believe, right before the war. It was about 17 in 1990. So by 1995 standards, today's Bosnia is, we have to be objective, a success compared to what we had in 1995. Now, why is it then that majority of commentators, academics, analysts consider this country to be, I don't want to say failure, but a problematic society in the middle of Europe? And I think this is why we're here today. And Daniel took a very interesting approach. He looked at, he wanted to talk about the importance of political parties, which, I mean, I should know, is very, very important. But I think that there's a larger context here that I would want us to focus on in the future, which is, I think the war in Ukraine has affected Bosnia more than any other country in Europe, without causing violence, thankfully. So Bosnia has avoided violence. 24 of February of 2022, the morning of, when we all woke up, it sort of seemed like Bosnia was on the chopping block, Putin's chopping block. But 2 and some years later, Bosnia is as peaceful as it was on 24 February of 2022. But I think the influence of the second Russian invasion of Ukraine on America's policy, America's Bosnia policy, in my view, is the most important element of America's view on Bosnia. And Daniel knows this, as I said in my opening speech, better than anybody in, I believe, better than anybody in Washington. That's outside of government. So that's my comment on Dan's speech and my contribution to further discussion.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Really great to be here. So I want to piggyback of something that Reuf just said, and I think is also apropos the comments that we heard from Professor Serwer. So this notion of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a success story, I think, is really, really interesting. Because I mean, I think it's objectively right. But then there's also this other tension, and I think Professor Serwer's comments really brought to the fore. And it's namely this: Bosnia is probably the only country in the world where one of the main tensions, if not the main tension, is actually between the majority of the public and its political representatives, who have indicated through both their publicly stated policy preferences, 2.5, 3 decades worth of voting patterns, the kind of output that the Bosnian intellectual community, academics, civil society, et cetera, that they all put out. There is clearly a critical consensus about the fact that Bosnia-Herzegovina is a country whose majority of its population wants to move towards the Atlantic community, wants to move towards the European community, wants to see the reform of Bosnia-Herzegovina's constitutional and political apparatus in line with the norms and values of what we consider the liberal democratic world. And in response, the predominant position, to be slightly simplistic, of both the United States and the EU has been no. You can't. Or at the very least, not yet. And I think the clearest articulation of that came to really link up with something that Reuf was saying at the end here, which is that the position of the Biden administration seems like one of the most important, outstanding, at the very least foreign policy, but also realistically domestic questions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The now former US regional envoy for the Western Balkans, a gentleman by the name of Gabriel Escobar, who I'm sure we're all familiar with. He gave an interview about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, I recall. And he was asked very specifically about the question of reform of Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitution in line with essentially a kind of civic, liberal, democratic, Euro-Atlantic model. And Mr. Escobar responded, of course Bosnia can become a civic state, he said, but not until it joins the European Union. And I thought this was the most fantastic and clearest articulation of how absolutely categorically categorically mistaken even very senior US officials were about basic political realities in Bosnia, but also Europe as well, right? Because by definition, Bosnia can't join the EU until it becomes a civic state. It's not the other way around. If it was, right, why not put Kyrgyzstan as it is right now into the European Union, right? Why not put Turkmenistan in there as well? Hey, it's an autocratic dictatorship, but maybe once it joins the EU, it'll become a civic democracy. No, the whole point is that the EU enlargement process is transformative, so you become a civic democracy, and then you join the EU. That's the prize at the end, theoretically speaking. But the very thing, the very fact that Mr. Escobar articulated this, to me speaks to, again, I think, to my mind, the most profound tension in, shall we say, the Bosnia-US relationship. And I'll kind of wind up on this. And this is something that Dan was saying, right? Dan brings his sort of personal experience to the table, and he makes a very, very powerful argument that I think we need to take very, very seriously. And that is that he says, you know, I, as a minority in my own country in the United States, feel better protected by a legislative, political, and constitutional regime which is founded on the idea of liberal and individual rights, right? I feel better protected in that context than I do by a collectivist framework. And this is, I think, the most perverse and ironic dimension of Bosnia's US-authored sectarian regime, which we are still today in the process of unpacking. The very thing that is supposed to, or what was supposed to provide peace and security for this country, this collectivist sectarian framework, is the very thing that has engendered generations of instability. And it is the thing that arguably is putting a damper on all the good statistics that Reuf was bringing to the fore. Because to my mind, the main story of contemporary Bosnia is not only how successful it is, but how successful it could be still more, right? If it did not have to contend with this retrograde constitutional regime that obviously, as the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, the most significant of which I think came down just last year, the Kovacevic decision suggests to us, right, the future of Bosnia has to be in line with the European Convention of Human Rights, but that unfortunately remains a very serious political debate. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, again. We have opened this conference, I'd say, in a rather unusual way by commenting on Professor Serwer's keynote speech. But in trying to go further into the details here, I'd like to return to a round of questions from my side, and then we can move to the questions from audience. Professor Serwer, we have indeed entered the final year of the administration of US President Joe Biden. And the United States remains the most important ally of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but in many ways, the citizens, the Bosnian polity is expected, much more of this administration. Could you perhaps give us an overview of what that policy was supposed to be in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what that policy in the end boiled down to in terms of President Biden's administration in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
First thing to understand is that Bosnia and Herzegovina is not top priority in Washington. The list of priorities probably starts with Ukraine, goes to Gaza, goes to Taiwan, goes to climate change, goes to another dozen priorities before you get to Bosnia and Herzegovina, or even close to it by talking about the Balkans in general. De facto, Biden has paid much more attention to Kosovo-Serbia relations than to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when you get that low down on the list of foreign policy priorities, you get a certain conservation of effort. Let's put it that way. That's the way the military puts it. You don't get a lot of resource in terms of high-level time and energy or money or personnel devoted to a lower priority issue. And there tends to be a certain disarticulation of policy as well. It's harder to coordinate. It's more delegated to the embassy, delegated to the different agencies of the US government, delegated without that kind of coherence that you hope for in responding to top priorities. It becomes a kind of holding action. Now, I think you have not seen only a holding action in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because there has been some initiative taken, and you see that initiative manifest, I think, in some of the high reps' decisions, which were probably more stimulated by the Americans than by the Europeans. They may have had some contributions from Croatia and from Serbia as well, but the European Union itself hasn't been pressing for action. They're more of the process will transform everything. The Americans, I think, do understand the virtues of liberal democracy, what you call here the civic state, but in America would be referred to as liberal democracy. I think the Americans do understand the importance of liberal democracy and defense of human rights. The question is how you get there from here. And it's a real puzzle. I don't want to suggest in any way that it's a simple question. It's a very complicated and difficult question. We thought the Dayton solution, when we were at Dayton and post-Dayton in particular, was a house of cards, that it would collapse. I notoriously opposed the Dayton solution before we went to Dayton. Why didn't I oppose it publicly? Why didn't I resign? Why didn't I send a dissent message? Well, it was because we all thought it was a house of cards, and if I was right, it was going to fall apart. Why put my career at risk for something that wasn't going to last? I'm not proud of not having done that. I hasten to add that I wish I had sent a dissent message. But the fact of the matter is that we did impose what the warring parties wanted. And we didn't understand at the time how much that was the case. At least I didn't understand. I'll speak for myself. I have to confess that I believe that Jim O'Brien did understand. That's the reason why the European Convention on Human Rights is written into the Dayton Constitution, because Jim understood that he needed to plant a landmine to undo the Dayton arrangements. Bosnians had proven very clever at resisting the landmine. They have not done the Sejdić-Finci correction that's required. I see Mr. Finci here. I don't know Mr. Sejdić, so if he's here. Look, I don't think that those in government today in the Biden administration would oppose a civic state in Bosnia. But you don't have the kind of political energy behind the effort that the people in this room would like to see. They wouldn't oppose it. They find it risky. They're worried that it would lead in bad directions. That's why we've always opposed a post-Dayton Dayton. But I think the time has come for Bosnians to take the initiative. Don't rely on the Americans.
Thank you very much, Professor Serwer. Just a disclaimer, Professor Serwer will have to leave at 10:45, so we're going to proceed accordingly. I'd like to...
But I will be back.
I'd like to move on to you, Yasmin. You've been quite vocal about the overall U.S. policy in the region and the goal of the so-called stabilocracy, the ultimate chase for that stabilocracy, and how has that reflected the overall policy making and the goals of the United States in the region. I cannot but mention this. How do you think a renewed Trump presidency would affect this goal, and what can we expect in that regards? We have President Biden leaving now or staying depending on the results, but thinking down the line in a scenario where a new president is in the United States, what does that mean for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what is more important, how does Bosnia and Herzegovina in a way prepare for that kind of scenario?
So I think first and foremost, the thing that we have to emphasize is that a second Trump administration would be a catastrophe for the United States, right? It would be a catastrophe for American rule of law. It would be a catastrophe for the American constitutional project, indeed the project of the Republic as a whole. And that cannot be underestimated, because any kind of serious domestic crisis, as would almost surely follow in the event of a Trump presidency, a second Trump presidency, is going to have all kinds of negative consequences for the entire world, right? Even if it's just the United States having to turn inwards and consume itself with, again, will be very significant political conflict. Even if the Trump administration doesn't get around to doing anything on its foreign policy agenda, it would be bad news. The second part is, if the Trump administration, if there is a second Trump administration, does get around to foreign policy issues, all of the indicators are that it would be extremely negative for the Western Balkans, but also Europe, right? We know that, unfortunately, Mr. Richard Grenell is very likely to be a very senior figure in the second Trump administration, very possibly Secretary of State. He was already Director of National Intelligence. We know, unfortunately, that he has exceptionally close ties to the authoritarian regime in Serbia. We know that the regime in Serbia has spent billions of dollars attempting to indirectly lobby the Trump family through some sweetheart real estate deals in Belgrade through the Kushner family and others. So this is transparent corruption, right? I mean, I have to be honest, and I will defer to Dan's expertise. I do find it quite shocking that the DOJ, the Department of Justice in Washington, has not pursued this matter more aggressively. I mean, perhaps they are doing so as we speak, but there it is. And then, of course, we know that Mr. Dodik here in Bosnia has been very explicit about the fact that he believes that a second Trump administration would be very, very positive, in particular for his secessionist agenda in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will caution us a little bit and say that this rhetoric was something that we heard from Mr. Dodik in 2016 and 2015 as well. And ultimately, the first Trump administration was kind of a bit of a non-event for Bosnia. The Trump administration did not have much of a Bosnian policy. It was extremely negative for Kosovo. Bosnia was inculcated a little bit. I'm fearful that a second time around we won't be as lucky. Again, having a lot to do in particular with Mr. Grenell's links to Vučić and Dodik. However, the last thing that I want to say on this point is that I think we also need to be a little bit cautious about what exactly a second Biden administration would mean for Bosnia. And I think Dan is absolutely right that, of course, Bosnia is not on the agenda in Washington. The Western Balkans are not on the agenda. And he's also right that that is first and foremost a failing on the part of folks here, right? And I mean, I include myself in that as somebody who, you know, I live abroad, but I like to think of myself as part of the community. The community might not think of myself that way, but there we are. All of which is to say is, I think, you know, I believe it was Reuf that made reference to Christian Schmidt's interventions in October of 22 and April of 23. Look, that was the most negative intervention by the international community possibly since Dayton. Right? I mean, we can debate one way or another, was there different moments, but it was the most significant retrenchment of the sectarian illiberal concept in Bosnia since 1995. And as Dan has pointed out, you know, in 1995, Dayton, whether we want to like to admit it or not, was arguably the best option available at the time. We can argue about that, okay, whatever, but let's just take it as an argument. If that is true, it certainly is not true that what Schmidt did in October of 22 and April of 23 was the best option available. And so this is the thing that I want to say. I mean, absolutely, it would be far, far preferable to get a second Biden administration than a second Trump administration. But it is not at all clear that a second Biden administration would ipso facto result in a strengthening of the liberal project in Bosnia.
Just a follow-up on that, Yasmin, very, very, very shortly. If we are not indeed lucky, as you said in the case of Trump administration, how do we build certain type of safety mechanisms? When I say we, I mean Bosnia and Herzegovina. What are the contingencies that we can, you know, rely upon in that case? How do we proceed with policy from our side towards the United States? I think that's also very.
I cut you off there. I think there's two things. First and foremost is we need to do the work here that we can do. That means protecting Bosnian state institutions to the greatest extent possible, specifically from Dodik and the SNSD. I have been very outspoken of the fact, and I will say it again here because I'm absolutely convinced about it, and I'm happy to argue with people in the hallway. The most catastrophic decision that was made by the current Bosnian government was handing over the security ministry to Nenad Nešić. Yeah. That was unacceptable. That was unacceptable. We now have a situation now, for instance, where we have this Serbian helicopter that is going to be supposedly stationed in Trebinje. Again, that is a failing by the Ministry of Defense of Bosnia and Herzegovina that it has seemingly allowed that. We need to be much, much more proactive and much, much more realistic about the threats to this country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's what Dan said. People, whether they want to accept it or not, there needs to be a sober reckoning with the possibility of conflict. I'm not saying it's around the corner, but I'm saying it's something, you know, as the old saying goes, right? If you want peace, prepare for war. So there we are. So we need to do a lot more work at the domestic level here in terms of protecting our institutions. The other major point, obviously, is that we need to broaden our outreach to the international community as a whole. This can be institutional through, obviously, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, though there are limits there. It can be through our intellectual community, many of us who are here and are already doing that work. But again, the other major point to my mind is something that is not happening in Bosnia is formal lobbying. Whether people want to admit it or not, or accept it or not, money moves the world. We have institutions in Bosnia that could do that. We could do it through the municipal level. We could do it through the cantonal level. The resources are there. The thing that is missing is the political will and the political understanding of the reality in which we find ourselves in. Again, I will just very quickly add, Aleksandar Vučić has spent billions of dollars trying to move U.S. policy. Bosnia and Herzegovina has spent $0.00. So what do you think the consequences of that will be if there is a second Trump administration?
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Moving to you, Reuf, I think I want to turn a bit towards the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's, among else, one of the central themes of this conference. We have seen before, we're having an issue here.
This is a domestic problem.
Yes, yes, not a foreign intervention. We have seen before the actions of OHR, and Professor Serwer has talked about it, and you as well, in past year regarding these de-blocking of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the suspension of the constitution, and what is often emitted is the blatant role of Croatia in this lobbying, and at the end of the day, designing of policy that is, in essence, an internal matter of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I want to ask, how can the Bosnian polity build resilience against this action in the face of the ethno-national exclusivity that, in the essence, the Croatian policy desires in Bosnia and Herzegovina? How does Bosnia and Herzegovina defend against this practice? And in that regards, perhaps you can offer your insights. How do we bridge the gap between our cause and the U.S. policy towards this issue? We have seen that the U.S. administration has actively supported the OHR in this regards.
So I'll try to be brief because Dan has to leave in a few minutes. Number one, the imposition on the night of the election in 2022 did not solve anything. It actually created problems that then Schmidt had to fix, in his own view, in April of 2023 by imposing a government. So this is an imposed government in the Federation that a lot of Western diplomats who were responsible for the policy do not want to admit. But it is just a fact. You can look it up on OHR's website. The government of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina was imposed by the OHR with full support of US and UK embassies. Now, in 2 years' time, after the 2026 general election in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as a result of Schmidt's first and the second decision, and I'm ready to bet, I'm not going to say it house, but I'm ready to bet my credibility on it, there will be no government of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because as a result of these two decisions, Zagreb and the HDZ have a veto power over government formation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is the most important element of Schmidt's decision. So instead of making the federation government, the whole process more functional, the only thing Schmidt really did is he gave Zagreb the ability to veto government formation process the way that Belgrade, for example, has in the RS through the state level, at the state level. So Belgrade got a veto in Dayton, 1995. Now Zagreb, as a result of Schmidt, 28, 29 years later, got a veto on the government formation process in the federation. And Zagreb wants the same thing that Belgrade has. They want the presidency. They want to be able to block everything through the BiH presidency. This is the essence of their policy. And I'm just going to stop with I'm going to quote what our dear friend, IUS Professor Jahja Muhasilović said, which is that as a result of what I just said, and this is something that people don't want to discuss very openly because it is so uncomfortable for a lot of us who, Bosnian Americans like Yasmin and myself and others in this audience, Americans who really are democracy-oriented, like those of you in the audience and people are going to watch this. This has created an incredible rift between Sarajevo, the political, I don't want to say elite, but people who observe politics in Sarajevo and Washington have realized that there's a rift for the first time ever between Sarajevo and Washington, because this is a minority government in Bosnia. The government does not have majority support of the citizens in reality, and this is something that is very uncomfortable. And I would say that's the only palpable long-term result of Schmidt's decision. And I will end by saying the following. Schmidt's impositions, 22 and 23 impositions, are the only decisions by the OHR, and this is a very important point, ever in 27 years, since 1997 when OHR got bond powers, that do not enjoy the majority support in the population. These are the only decisions that do not enjoy majority support of the population. Every single decision by OHR until then, had it been put to a referendum, would have gotten the 50% plus one of the citizens. These decisions are extremely unpopular, and this is something that Washington is wedded to and causes a lot of friction between, decision makers who, in Bosnia and Washington. I'll end there. Dan, I'll see you back soon.
Thank you very much.
Reuf understands the details of the decisions much better than I do, and I take a somewhat different approach to the question. I see it as a structural issue, and the structure I'm talking about is the structure of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, including the federation. It was designed in 1994 to end a war. The Croatians controlled the flow of weapons to the Bosnian army from the Adriatic. They were in a very strong position to dictate the structure of the federation, and they did that. They got half the federation when they were nowhere near half the population. They even got an agreement on confederation, which you're lucky has never been implemented. The Croats got half the federation and 1/3 of the state at Dayton. This is a direct violation of the rights of the rest of the population. And as long as the federation exists, I'm afraid that we're going to have problems with it. What needs to be done is to create the conditions for a more civic Bosnia in which Croats can feel fully protected in their individual rights by state institutions. And I don't think that requires that they own 50% of half of Bosnia. So I think of it as a structural problem, and one that goes way beyond the decisions of the High Rep. I'm going to have to leave briefly, but I will be back, and I will look forward to continuing the discussion.
Please, a round of applause for Professor Serwer. We are close to wrapping up this panel. Before we do so, I'd like to offer the chance to the audience to ask any questions, if there is any, for the remaining speakers. I see Hassan. Yes, absolutely. Shall we do, is there anybody else that wants to ask questions? Okay, then.
Okay, one. Yasmin, just a short question. I was impressed by your presentation of the facts. I mean, your knowledge. I've been aware of your knowledge prior to this conference. I follow your work almost on a daily basis. But I did not quite understand. Can you tell us what is the worst case scenario regarding the outcome of the coming elections in the United States? Because as far as I understand, in either case, we are going to lose the support of the United States. And it might even be worse than it is now. So whether Biden wins or Trump wins, we are going to be in a worse position than now. That's my understanding. I don't know. I didn't quite understand. What is the good? What is the good scenario for us also, if there is any good scenario?
Let's take all the questions. Adelheid, I see, is raising her hand before we respond.
Yeah, I would like to add something when it comes to the possible Trump presidency and the idea of the land swap, which could come up again and could have, related to Kosovo and Serbia, but could have further impact for Bosnia? Do you see any attempts by Kushner, Grenell, Trump, whoever, to bring it up again by Vučić and Mr. Rama, who plays also a very important role in this? Thank you.
Please, Adelheid, just introduce yourself for the rest of the audience.
My name is Adelheid Wölfer. I'm the correspondent for Southeastern Europe for the Austrian Daily Der Standard and for several other newspapers, and I'm living in Sarajevo.
We have one more. Just state your name, introduce yourself, affiliation.
Hello, my name is Mirza Cherkez, and I have a question which is a bit blunt. When we analyze all together events from the 20th century, I just have to ask one question. Why is the compromise of a Yugoslav nation that has been created and formed in the first Yugoslavia, the kingdom, and second ameliorated in the second Yugoslavia, some kind of holy cow that must not be even thought of? When, if we are going to follow through the details, after the Second World War, communism, socialism, downfall of socialism, colonialism, post-colonialism, that idea in its core is rather racy. Why do we have to adhere to that like some sort of divine scripture which, if you doubt, you go straight to the hell without any possible pardon? Thank you.
Perhaps you, Yasmin, can take a couple, and Reuf, maybe you from...
So to the first question, I mean, I think in some ways, at least part of the first question was answered by the second question. I think you're absolutely right that, you know, as we would say here, loše nam se piše. For Bosnia, I think the region realistically, and when I say the region, I mean those of us in the region who are committed to, you know, to democracy, to peace, to genuine political reform. So that's certainly not everyone in the region, right? But I would like to believe that it's a critical mass of us. The Trump administration represents a more, shall we say, existential threat. In part, or rather maybe not in part, but primarily because of what Trump has threatened to do with the broader transatlantic relationship, right? If we take him seriously, and I think we should take him seriously, because pretty much everything that he said he would attempt to do at one point or another, he at least tried, and sometimes just trying certain things is destructive. So he has threatened very explicitly, for instance, that he would pull the US out of NATO, or at the very least that he would immediately shut down US military support for Ukraine. I think that would be a huge boost towards the very militant aspirations of people like Vučić, people like Dodik, and others who really have a material interest in destroying Bosnia as a state. I mean, to Dan's point, I think Trump very seriously reanimates the possibility of violence and conflict, not just in Bosnia, but in the region as a whole. I absolutely take the view that what happened in Banjska, in Kosovo, was a trial balloon that, had it succeeded, we would right now be talking about a Republika Srpska Severa Kosovo. Something of that nature, right? It was a trial balloon. And so in that sense, Trump is just a kind of chaos agent. The distinction with Biden is that I don't think Biden is a chaos agent. I think Biden's policies have been deeply negative for Bosnia. I think the Biden administration folks have an unfortunate tendency as a result of people like Jake Sullivan to think that they are the smartest people in every room, which I think respectfully is not true. We all remember Mr. Sullivan's article 2 days, 3 days before October 7th, right? Yeah. Right. So I will gently suggest that I think probably everyone sitting in this room knows Bosnia better than Jake Sullivan, right? And so the threat represented by the Biden administration is not existential, but it is kind of, you know, death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's kind of that model. Now that, from a purely strategic standpoint for Bosnia, is preferable to a Trump administration because we can work with that a little bit better. But I'm not at all suggesting that we should in any sense expect a massive improvement in the Biden administration's posture towards the region or Bosnia. And the last sort of point that I'll raise here vis-a-vis that question, and then I want to tie on to what Adelheid was saying. Look, when we look at the Biden's Western Balkans policy as a whole, I think the most instructive place to look is in Belgrade. And when we look at who the ambassador is in Belgrade, Mr. Christopher Hill, and what Mr. Hill says, how he says it, I have never in my life seen an American ambassador like Christopher Hill. Christopher Hill is essentially behaving as though he is a spokesperson for the government of Serbia. And I think that is deeply instructive for how the Biden administration views Bosnia, how it views the region. Its focus is on Belgrade, on Zagreb, and to a slightly lesser extent, Tirana. It does not care about Montenegro, it does not care about Bosnia, it does not care about Kosovo. And unsurprisingly, those three countries are the ones that have suffered the most as a result of Biden's policies. We see what's happened to Montenegro, we see what's happening in Kosovo, we see what's happening in Bosnia. And then to Adelheid's question, just to tie back, I absolutely think that is another one of the things, this so-called land swap, razgraničenje, I think is absolutely back on the agenda if Trump is back. Though I will say one thing there that I think oftentimes is forgotten. It was not Trump that came up with the land swap. And the Trump administration, people just kind of ran with it because to their mind it was, transactionalism, whatever, we'll go with it, that's fine. Exactly. I mean, if you want to look at the architects of the land swap, you have to look at people like Federica Mogherini, you have to look at Vučić himself, you have to look at Rama, you have to look at Janez Janša, you even have to look at people like, unfortunately, the person who is likely to be the next EU envoy for Kosovo, Serbia, Borut Pahor, who, very infamously asked the members of the Bosnian presidency how they would feel about the dissolution of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So I think the Europeans, in that sense, don't have, a hill to stand on when they're criticizing Trump on the land swap because they're just as guilty, if not more guilty, than the Trump administration. And in a situation where we have a kind of rising far right in Europe, and shall we say, oftentimes kind of far-right curious mainstream, right? I mean, I'm not going to start talking about Emmanuel Macron, but let's just say I have a lot of criticisms. But all of which is to say it's a combination of factors. So obviously a second Trump administration, very negative, but it's not just about Trump.
Perhaps you, Reuf? Final.
So I'm going to answer the last question first. So the question of Yugoslavia. Mark Attila Hoare, a British historian, British Balkans historian, just wrote a book on Serbia, which I actually read, almost all of it. It's a very lengthy volume, about 900 pages, and it is a tour de force. I highly recommend all of you to read it. And in the book, there's a piece, there's a part which explains why so many are so in love with the idea of Yugoslavia. And he basically says Yugoslavia originally was conceived as an idea, it's a greater Serbia without the name. I mean, that was the original idea. The Tito's Yugoslavia was a different creation, but still the Serbs dominated the country, which I think is undeniable. But I think the view of some in the West is somewhat similar to what Marko explains was the idea behind the original Yugoslav state, which is that Serbia is the center of gravity of the region. And I heard this in Washington a few weeks ago. We had an event at Hudson with the Hudson Institute, and somebody said something that really unnerved me. And since it was a person, of stature, I couldn't respond. He said, if you get Serbia right, you got the Balkans right. I'm quoting. This is a direct quote. And this is a person who knows the region extremely well. So Biden folks who deal with the region see Belgrade, Zagreb, and Tirana as the three capitals that if you get those right, you get the region. It's the so-called pivotal states theory. And it's a good theory. I mean, it sounds great if you read it and you write about it, and the more you read and write about it, the more in love you fall with it. But that's not how history operates. I mean, there are no lesser peoples, and I think Bosniaks have allowed themselves to be seen as a lesser people, in my view. And there are a number of reasons for that. I'm getting there's one more question and a comment from the audience, right?
Just introduce yourself, please.
I will. I just wanted to do something that in Washington we call a two-finger on Yasmin. Ivana Cvetković Bajrović. Once upon a time, I was also doing a lot of policy work in Washington, but I didn't have the luxury to comment on U.S. domestic policy, so I'm going to use the liberty to do so now and say something that is going to be maybe a little bit controversial, but maybe a little bit hopeful as well. I don't know. In answer to Hassan's question, I'm going to disagree with Yasmin. I do think that quite possibly that both outcomes, the Biden or the Trump administration, might be bad for Bosnia. But I would dare say that maybe the Trump administration gives us a little bit more hope. Because I do think that with the Biden administration, and maybe I'm not objective because I find what the Biden administration has done in Bosnia to be so profoundly disappointing, and I take it very, very personally, I have to say, as someone who supported the administration in the campaign process. But at the same time, I do think that at least with the Trump administration, there might be some hope of influencing policy. I don't think we have that option with the Biden administration anymore. There's way too many people in the Biden administration who are so vested in what they've done in the last 4 years in Bosnia, which is horrible what they've done. And I think it's going to, and also sometimes you have the disadvantage when you have people who know Bosnia or any place so well, it's very difficult to change their mind because they think they know the best. I think very highly of Jim O'Brien, very highly. But I'm sure he's set in his ways and in the way he thinks about this region, and it's going to be very difficult to influence that, whether we try to do it in Washington or elsewhere. So I still hold hope that regardless of what it's going to be like for domestic policy, I think that at the very least with the change of administration, we might have the opening, we might have the opportunity to influence things a little bit differently, and we shouldn't miss that opportunity should that be the outcome of the US election.
All right, so I'm going to answer Adahai's question now. So thank you, Ivana. I'm not sure that the conventional wisdom will be proven right. One thing we learned during the first Trump administration, in Washington, I'm talking about people who were in the blob, as they call it in Washington. It's, people who do policy work, who know some decision makers, and that's more or less everybody in Washington. Washington is like Hollywood for smart people. Like a lot of people come and try to make a difference, and most fail. But it was so chaotic that because of the chaos, there was a chance to influence things. And I wrote a piece in, I think it was 2019, in The American Interest, which was very heavily criticized, in which I pointed out the facts about the Kosovo-Serbia land swap idea. And the fact was that the idea did not originate with the Trump White House. The idea originated with Federica Mogherini's office. I mean, as far as we know. I mean, that's what you say Vučić, but we don't know. Because at that time, Taci was I'll tell you something. Taci was in power at that time. And some of us, yes, yeah. Some of us in the room were in touch with some of Taci's people. So Taci accepted the idea. It's just a fact. It was not something that was only, it wasn't one-sided. It was the government in Belgrade and government in Pristina that agreed to start talking about it. That's what it was. And then what it turned into was that some of us who were openly Democrats used that fact, and the fact that Trump administration was very neutral or positive to it, to use it for domestic political purposes in the US. That's what we did. To use the fact that Trump administration was open to it And the narrative was changed from it originated with Vučić, Taci, Mogherini into, well, this is Trump administration's idea, he's going to destroy the world, we got to get him out of the White House. That's what happened. So I'm not so sure that Trump too is going to be completely fixated on it. And I'm not so sure that Grenell is going to prevail in the intra-Republican gladiatorial fight for the State Department. I'm not so sure, because this is, I think, something that we were so fixated on. I mean the policy community, that we have to look at what happened in 2018, 2019, and so on. You had Pompeo, who was far, far more influential than I think people give him credit for, because Pompeo was the one who ran realistically ran the Balkans policy. Grenell was trying to influence the debate. And then one thing that people most often forget, you had Mike Pence. And Mike Pence had a lot of strong people, influential people in the White House who dealt with the region. One of them you know and I know, and some other people in the room know, was Mali, who it wasn't that simple, is what I'm trying to say. If you had to bet your house, you probably would bet your house on the fact that Trump is going to continue with this land swap idea. If you had $100 to bet, you could bet on many different outcomes, including Trump being very, very bad for Serbia, bad for Putin, good for Ukraine. Anything's possible. As I think Yasmin is right, he's the agent of chaos. But one thing we're certain of is that if we get Biden too, we're going to have what we have today.
Unless we have more questions, this concludes the first panel. We'll take perhaps a 15-20 minute break before we proceed with the second one. Thank you very much.
I would like to wish you a warm welcome for our second panel for today. The panel will be focused on the question of how did Christian Schmidt's interventions whether they made Bosnia functional. So for the beginning, I would like to introduce our panelists. Professor Jahja Muhasilović from the International University of Sarajevo, Professor Tanya Domi from Columbia University, and Mr. Zlatko Hadžidedić, a political analyst and commentator. As you may be already familiar, the recent interventions and decisions made by the Office of High Representative have caused a lot of discussion within the general public. For some of them, they were controversial and raised a lot of questions regarding their implications, positive and negative, for the functionality of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So one of the most prominent one was the electoral change from the October in 2022, as well as the decisions made during the 2023. So for the beginning, I would like to give the floor to our panelists to give you an introductory words. Yes.
Okay. So welcome everyone. I would like to talk about the dynamics which has led to what is going on at the moment, and that is related to US-Bosnian relations. And I believe what has happened in Bosnia and its relations with Washington did not happen out of sky. So it had some pre-dynamics which has caused for this situation to evolve. So I divided those dynamics into three main dynamics. So I would say international, domestic, and regional dynamics influenced the relations between Bosnia and, generally speaking, America's stance towards Bosnia and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Roughly and chronologically speaking, all this has started somewhere in mid-2000s. So certain international dynamics caused United States to slightly change its stance towards Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the most important thing is that the United States started losing its interest and focus towards Bosnia somewhere when Bush administration came to power. So few international dynamics influenced Bush administration's priorities in foreign policy. So you have launch of global war on terror at the beginning of the 2000s, when America started changing its focus and basically transferring its focus towards Middle East, towards Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, another important thing which happened back then is, and that was basically was manifested in the transition of power from United States towards the European Union. To remind you, in 2004, there was this transition from S4 to U4. That was important transition when basically Washington said that the Brussels should take care of the Western Balkans and Bosnia and Herzegovina particularly. And in 2004, you have the start of the EUFOR Althea mission, when there was no more American forces here in Bosnia, and basically Europeans took over. That happened in December 2004. Another important dynamic was a 2003 Thessaloniki summit, when basically regions, when the countries in the region, they basically alleged themselves and pledged their loyalty towards the EU integrations. So Americans recognized back then that European Union could take over the role of state building in Bosnia, which was primarily done until mid-2000s was done by the United States. Fourth important dynamic was 2008 financial crisis, which has hit Western world particularly. And Western world basically for 4 or 5 years was dealing with the serious financial crisis and had hands full of solving the issues back home related to financial institutions, banking and economic institutions. And that opened the space for non-Western states to become more active in Bosnia and Herzegovina, states such as Russia, China, Gulf Arab states, Turkey, and other states, which became, at that point, started becoming more influential in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that was the emergence of the new geopolitical actors here in Bosnia. And all that has caused domestic dynamics to evolve in a way that we feel today. That is roughly the years when Dodik-Čović alliance started emerging, when Dodik and the Serbian politics recognized that Americans are not so much interested anymore in the Balkans, and that opened space for Serbia and for Russia to project their power here in Bosnia. Of course, Dodik and Čović, they recognized themselves to be a natural allies against the pro-Bosnian forces inside the Bosnian politics. So that is related to international politics. When it comes to domestic dynamics, that they also were influenced by the international dynamics. So the first serious backtracking was April package. April package, which happened again in the mid-2000s, caused Western powers to basically lose their interest, along other things which were on an international stage, of course. So that was not isolated, that lack of interest was not isolated to domestic politics. But April package was and failure of April package was a signal for the Western diplomats that they basically, the state building process in Bosnia is in lockdown, so it cannot be proceed. And that was an attempt of the Western diplomatic world where they gave an initiative to domestic actors to solve the issues in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they failed. They could not agree on that. I would not like to enter into discussion whether April package was a good or bad, so I believe both sides are having their arguments related to April package, and I believe the truth is somewhere in between those two positions. But definitely, April package was a negative signal for the Western diplomats to lose their interest here in Bosnia. After that, you have Butmir process, you have Prud process, and all these mid-level diplomatic initiatives by the Western community to basically continue the state building here in Bosnia, and all ended up in a failure. Another dynamic which has helped the disruptive forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, such as Dodik and Čović, was a weakness of pro-Bosnian forces. So pro-Bosnian forces, state forces, were too weak to implement anything on anyone, and they were too weak to basically stop Čović and Dodik in their attempt to weaken Bosnia's state institutions. So their main sin was a lack of leadership. Lack of leadership of pro-Bosnian side opened the space for Čović and Dodik to become alpha and omega of political life here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The reason why there was a lack of leadership there were a few reasons. One of them was a lack of vision. So pro-Bosnian side did not have vision how to continue state building without the help of the uninterested Western community. We did not have national strategy, a document which would set of standards and which would be a guideline for leading Bosnia forward. So pro-Bosnian side did not have that kind of national pact or vision or a document that would be a guideline. So lack of national strategy was the ideal space for Dodik and Čović to basically, for them to lead the political life and the political dynamics here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Another sin of the pro-Bosnian side, I would say, is that they stopped lobbying where decision makers are. So they stopped lobbying in Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin, in London, in Paris, in Ankara, I would say. So that was another problematic issue for the Bosnian side that helped basically Serbian and Croatian politics here in Bosnia. And the most important thing I would say, which was preventing state building and basically preventing Bosnia to function as a civic state was the fact that the Annex 7 was not ever implemented. So the reality of the war, where you had ethnic cleansing in the entity of Republika Srpska, basically continued into today. And without implementation, full implementation of Annex 7, we cannot talk of civic state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's basically impossible because you have roughly 75% of Bosnia which is ethnically cleansed, and people, they did not return to their prior places of living. Another dynamic was a regional, it was interrelated regional and domestic dynamics. So all this what I have shortly have explained have basically triggered Croatian politics in Bosnia and Herzegovina to become more aggressive. So a lot of things that the Čović and HDZ are doing today is out of fear. So what has caused that fear? In my opinion, it's an irrational fear, but again, they are led by fear, of existential fear. And the first serious document which has caused that fear was the census of 2013. In census of 2013, Croatian politics, they recognized that they are losing ground here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They used to be, according to census of 1995, they used to be 18%. In the census of 2013, they are 15%. But if you go back to prior Yugoslav censuses, you would see that at the mid of the past century, they were around 1/4 of the population. So in just few decades, they were reduced from 1/4 of the population to 15% of the population. Effectively speaking, Bosnian Croats might be less than 10% of the population. So what Zagreb has recognized, and the HDZ of Bosnia and Herzegovina have recognized, that they are losing ground here in Bosnia. And they asked one legitimate question, that the Bosniaks one day might ask a question why we should share the same power with the Croats who are less than 10%, and we are probably above 55, or even effectively speaking, probably 60% of the population. So that demographic reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina is ruining the constitutive organization of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, the census happened in 2013, the year when Croatia entered the European Union. And when the Croatia entered the European Union, that process of emigration of Croats from Bosnia and Herzegovina was only speeded up. So effectively speaking, maybe only 7 or 8% of Croats are now in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that has created a huge panic among the Croat politics here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Zagreb. Of course, Croatia, it used the opportunity. They are full members since 2013, full members of the EU, and since 2009, full members of the NATO. They use their voice in EU and NATO to lobby for their cause, to keep federation under the control of Zagreb. And they basically reactivated all old policies of Croatia here in Bosnia, which were active during the 1990s and the early 2000s. They started talking about the third entity. Of course, not openly, but they started emphasizing the policies of consociation. The policies that the HDZ is leading here in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the help of international community and with the help of the Christian Schmidt, is leading to Cyprus scenario. Basically having entity of Republika Srpska under the control of Belgrade and entity of Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina under the control of Zagreb. And of course that concept is ending the discussion of civic state in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Another thing which has, I believe, frightened HDZ is a coalition of SDA and DF. Because first time in the modern history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have conservative political party entering a coalition with what we call a civic political party. And that coalition has proven that basically that the discussion of Bosniak versus Bosnian, or civic organization versus ethnic organization of Bosnia and Herzegovina, was ended basically with the census of 2013, where the majority of Bosniaks said that they are Bosniaks, not Bosnians, and with the formation of the SDA-DF coalition. And we now see that that coalition is a backbone of a wider coalition that is being formed at the moment here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So civic and ethnic forces, political forces, proven that they can work together for the sake of the national interest. And I believe that also has frightened the HDZ. And basically, 2013 census has ended the Bosnian versus Bosniak dichotomy and the discussion where, as I said, majority of the Bosniaks said that they are Bosniaks and they can stay Bosniaks, and that is not going against the civic organization of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Another thing I believe which has frightened not only HDZ but SNSD as well, and also Western community here in Bosnia, at least some cells of the Western community here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is the possible influence from the Middle East, especially from Turkey. SDA's victory in the two electoral cycles has proven, and the close ties of the Bakir Izetbegović with the Turkish President Erdogan has frightened the West and the Bosnian and the Bosnian Croat and Bosnian Serb politicians here, that despite this, in spite of this demographic increase of the Bosniaks and the fact that they might question the organization, constitutional organization of Bosnia, of this ethnic division, and the very fact that the strongest political party is nurturing good ties with the AKP in Turkey has created a lot of panic inside the Western community. And Turkey was degraded to the status of malign influence, whether they want to admit that or not. In the Western diplomatic circles, Turkey is today seen as a malign influence. They don't want to say that openly because Turkey is a full NATO member and aspirant for the EU, but that is how they see Turkey today. And they were afraid that the rise of Bosniak demographic opportunity, how Čović is calling that, might create a Bosniak nation state. And if that happens, that is basically killing all the ambitions of the Belgrade and Zagreb here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that had to be stopped. That is how they perceive that. So what they did, they entered one, I believe, political suicide in long run. They started creating a political coalition of two civic political parties of SDP and Naša stranka together with what we call People and Justice Party. So they helped the creation of People and Justice Party from all these people who left the SDA to have a conservative ally for that coalition, that minority government that Reuf has mentioned in the previous panel. And of course that was done with the help of a lot of money which came from the United Arab Emirates, and I believe that is not by chance. So we had similar recipe in the rest of the Muslim world where with the Emirati money, a lot of alternative conservative political parties were sponsored. So that model was implemented here in Bosnia as well. And they were in need of such a political party in order to have a treason, to be honest. A treason which happened with the help of SDP and Naša stranka here in Bosnia, and with the blessings of the Western diplomatic corps, especially with the blessings of the American embassy here in Sarajevo. And the next step was basically to force this Troika Pact to enter alliance with HDZ and to basically help HDZ to get what they were asking for years. But on the other hand, of course, we could stop by blaming Troika and HDZ and the Western diplomacy. But the question I would like to ask here is why we, as a pro-Bosnian side, still don't have a vision. We still have a lack of vision. We still have a lack of action. We still have lack of unity. And we are still not lobbying in the circles of power in the Western capitals. So that is the question that we should address here and the question that we should deal with. If we were doing these things, I believe all this would not happen to us. And I would end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Ralph and the U.S.-Europe Alliance for inviting me today. It's wonderful once again to be back in Sarajevo and seeing many friends and colleagues It's always good to be here. I was asked by Ralph to talk about the High Representative. A number of comments have already been made. I certainly agree with both Ralph's and Yasmin's comments, but I'm going to get straight to it, and that is, remember the premise, do no harm? Do we remember that premise, do no harm? The combination of the High Representative's actions with the full backing of the United States, I think is one of the worst decisions I have ever witnessed in the last 30 years since the Dayton Peace Accords were signed in Paris. It is absolutely shameful to thumb your nose at the Venice Commission and the so-called EU values, upholding the rule of law, which dictates that no electoral laws will be passed in the year leading up to an election. But not only did they seek to avoid, no doubt, a thumbs down initiative at the Venice Commission, but they went a step further and they imposed these new laws on the night of an election. That is one of the most outrageous incidents I've ever heard of in the world. And as a matter of fact, in this region and anywhere where the West and democracies live and exist and carry out the rule of law, doing this would be an outrage, would be called on. The United States would call on that country to retract whatever just happened. But do no harm. There has been so much harm created. And now we have these institutions with the Constitution being imposed and the government being opposed in the Federation. We have a situation that will probably, if ever, be fixed. Because once it goes into an institution, then in the situation of Bosnia-Herzegovina with 3 ethnic groups under the Dayton construct, everybody's got to come together. And we can see how that really doesn't work, unfortunately, with a number of obstructionists. Now, allegedly, this deal with Zagreb, there's another aspect to this as well that is, I think, incredibly pernicious and corrosive to the sovereignty of this country, where you go and talk to Zagreb about their interests in these electoral laws. That is simply outrageous, but not surprising under the circumstances. And let me just say, in the period leading up to these actions was quite challenging here. We're talking about the initial letter from Blinken to the minister, to the Council of Ministers, was so average and so mediocre, I was shocked by the agenda. And that is electoral laws, corruption, next. And we're looking at a situation where at that time, Russia has already threatened Bosnia's aspirations to NATO, 1. 2, Giannis, this mystery white paper, Balkan white paper, goes circulating around the region saying we're going to do a swap and the RS should leave Bosnia, join Serbia, Kosovo should join with Albania. This is being floated around by Giannis, allegedly. He doesn't deny it. There's denials, and then there's like, it becomes a very interesting issue to talk about. And at the time, the Slovenes were leading the EU. I have to also add, this is the time where HDZ and Dragan Čović were all really pushing the third entity, the third bloc. And this is in the years, immediate years after the Sejdić-Finci decision, and which is followed by 4 additional electoral issues by the European Court of Human Rights. Why wasn't at top of mind the imposition of these judgments? How could the High Rep constructively contribute to the democracy and rule of law? This is an obvious one. I totally own it. I am a human rights professor, but it's a practice of democracy, and rule of law is basic to a democratic process. And could we not add how alienating and polarizing this decision was in the middle of this situation? And then what follows in the following years, the war in Ukraine begins and casts a long shadow across the Balkans. I agree with Ralph that it's really hurt Bosnia, the war, but I also think it has also undermined Kosovo's aspirations too. I mean, they've doubled down. Serbia and Russia has doubled down, blocking them at every turn. And just recently I met with the Council of Europe representative in Pristina, somebody a lot of people here know, Marianne Hennessy, and she said it was unfortunate in terms of the Council of Europe turning down the bid to join the Council of Europe because there was like more than 6 countries in the Council of Europe don't recognize Kosovo. So it faces incredible obstruction in its battle to become a recognized sovereign state. And so partnering this with US foreign policy that has been, as Ivana pointed out, really disappointing. And I plead guilty. I thought it was an opportunity to reset US policy with Joe Biden being elected president. I was actually excited about that, and I owned up to it early that I was wrong. You know, you can say whatever you want to say. Yes, the president has a lot of issues on his desk. There's no doubt about it. But I would add that it's very obvious that the White House has detailed Balkan policy to the State Department, and I actually, up until maybe Jim O'Brien just recently took over, maybe these people were lost. And I would give compliments to Dan Serwer, who's written extensively about the conduct of our diplomats, and I would also add that I think Christopher Hill, I'm shocked, but no longer surprised by any statement he's going to make that appears to be codifying the Serbian nationalist extreme government. I would also, interesting, at this time, when actually Secretary Clinton made a trip through the Balkans at Harriman Institute, where I teach at Columbia, former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, gave the annual Harriman lecture. And during a dinner after the lecture, I asked him about Obama and his interest or not in the Balkans. And he actually said to me that President Obama didn't demonstrate any interest in the white ethnics of the Eastern Europe. None whatsoever. And if you recall, he did call the Russians the JV team during that meeting in Berlin, which was pretty unbelievable. So now I just want to follow up to your comments about what was going on, you really had the ending of the Dayton office in the first week of the George W. Bush administration. Colin Powell closed that office. Then we go into the Obama administration that made a priority of getting an agreement with Iran. And so they detailed, for example, to Lady Ashton in the UK and Lady Ashton to initiate the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue. And Hillary Clinton made a one-trip sweep through the Western Balkans. First time Secretary of State has been here. But clearly not, you know, there was not a lot of follow-up. And then this is followed by Trump, and we all know what happened during that time, and now the Biden policy. So I remain somewhat reticent to talk about future administrations. I don't disagree with the possibility that there could be ability to persuade a second Trump administration. It's very clear with the Biden people, they know that you can't tell them, and that's basically where it stands. They know what's best. And I'm not sure I've added all that much, but I will repeat, let's do no harm. Let's stop playing with people's lives. This country deserves better from the international community. I've worked around the world, and I learned this personally, that you do not bring your own problems to a country that's facing such formidable challenges. I leave my comments there.
Thank you for coming to this great event. If I sound a bit nebulous, don't be too hard on me. I didn't sleep the whole night. I was traveling, so I will try to do my best to articulate what I consider, well, if not the essence, but an essence of the problem of why such things as Schmidt's decisions can occur in the first place. Of course, I will say only one sentence about Schmidt's decisions. They are unconstitutional. That's all I can say. I mean, he violated the Dayton Constitution, and he was supposed to be, well, what's the polite word? Ejected from the position. So, why these things can happen? Of course, Bosnia-Herzegovina with the High Representative, it's visible to everyone, is not a sovereign state. But the problem with Bosnia-Herzegovina is not having a High Representative. The problem is that Bosnia has practically dismantled its own sovereignty, or has been imposed a dismantling of Bosnia's sovereignty long time ago. I'm not going to mention the Dayton Peace Agreement in this context. The Dayton Peace Agreement was simply a verification of the pattern that was established, well, long time before. All these events that Jahja has mentioned, I would subscribe to them. They stand as they are. But there is one key event, literally key event, which shaped the entire past and present of this state. It's the so-called Lisbon Conference. I keep mentioning that, and I cannot avoid repeating it because it is still the key event, and people are still neglecting this fact. Because that's the place where the principles of sovereignty were violated, or if you like, have been violated, because they are still present. The basic principles of sovereignty are that sovereignty is indivisible and non-transferable. Jean Bodin. We can find similar thoughts in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. We can find it in John Locke's works, in Rousseau, but Bodin postulated these two principles. At the Lisbon Conference, these two principles were totally dissolved. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, these two principles stopped being relevant. Bosnia is a different kind of a state, unlike any other in the world, because sovereignty of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the then sovereignty of Bosnia-Herzegovina, up to 1991-92, was divided at that conference by Lord Peter Carrington with the assistance of José Coutilheiro, a Portuguese diplomat. Carrington was presiding over the conference on the former Yugoslavia. They simply proposed ethnic partition with granting sovereignty, pieces of sovereignty, to three ethno-nationalist leaders, or three leaders of ethno-nationalist parties. In that way, sovereignty was transferred to the three of them. To the present day, we have this same pattern. It has not changed. Whatever we say, well, we would like to have more civic constitution, we would like to fight against ethnic partition and so on, it is all rooted in this very process of dismantling of Bosnia's sovereignty. And unless and until we actually go back to the basic principles of sovereignty as they stand in every single constitution in the world and stand for every state, every country in the world, we will not have Bosnia being like any other country in the world. It will be as it is, something which cannot properly be even defined. Because ever since we have this kind of transfer to the ethnic leaders, and they have created their ethnic territories, they needed a war for that, and the war served the purpose of so-called ethnic cleansing, to create homogeneous territories, ethnically homogeneous territories. And ever since, we have the rule of three ethno-nationalist leaders in three quasi-sovereign territories. And they are striving to actually create sovereign states out of them. Even the very concepts that we use in this country, when we say that we have Serbs, Bosniaks, Croats, that they are nations or nationalities, we are suggesting that they have an inherent right to make their own states, that they were right to divide Bosnia's sovereignty and strive for creation of their own sovereign states. So that's something which we face every day, to the extent that we have forgotten how it actually came into being. And I think that's our problem, that we keep forgetting how things actually occurred, how we got into all this mess. It's a conceptual mess in the first place. I was announced as political analyst, but I prefer to see myself as a political theorist. So sorry for so much theory. But if we don't go back to the principles of sovereignty and say that this model that was created at the Lisbon Conference and verified at the Dayton Conference is simply unsustainable, that it cannot survive in any country as a model, and that no country can survive with this model of quasi-sovereignty that we have, unless we actually reject the very idea of sovereignty's division and sovereignty's transfer as it was done at the Lisbon Conference. We will be in this vicious circles, and we will remain there. There is no way to get out of it. So the story is about corruption, fighting corruption, doing this, doing that. You know, they cannot play any role. They cannot change anything. This state has been deprived of its sovereignty back in '92. What needs to be done is to recreate its sovereignty in the very way as it has been done in any other European or non-European country, which means that all citizens, of course, have the right to vote, that they are the bearers of sovereignty, that they invest their sovereignty into a single body of will, and that will is called the nation. This is the only country which does not want to have its own nation, but instead forces itself and forces its population to divide into three groups which are falsely called nations. Or if they are rightly called nations, then we don't have a single country, we will have three countries, as Henry Kissinger notoriously said when he heard about the war in Bosnia. He asked, well, what was happening there? What is happening there? And he was replied, well, some three nations are fighting each other. And he said, why should they fight each other? You know, they should have three states. It's as simple as that. And this is the only place on earth where we don't see these basics. We have to go back to the very idea of sovereignty as indivisible and non-transferable, which means that this country needs to be a nation state. It has to have its own Bosnian nation because our population, whether we call them ethnic groups or ethno-religious groups, which is more precise and more accurate, they were forced into these categories. Back in 19th century, they were forced by priests, first Orthodox priests, then Catholic priests. Then Muslims were forced into that back in '93. No one asked the population what they actually wanted to be. If you say, well, I'm just a Bosnian, you cannot be just a Bosnian. Even during a census, you need to put that you belong to one of these three groups. So we are all forced into these three categories. We are forced into division and division of sovereignty and into the transfer of sovereignty to three ethno-nationalist leaders. And that's the situation we have, and it needs to be changed. We just have to return to Jean Bodin, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to John Locke, and those theorists who postulated the modern theories of sovereignty, of popular sovereignty. And that is all. Nothing else. Everything else is just, you know, the repetition of the stereotypes that were introduced by the British diplomats like Lord Carrington, like 3 tribes are fighting each other, it's the Balkans, or many other patterns, many other stories, many other narratives that have been used. But that's something which obviously only reproduces the very same results as we have had them for so many years. So I would really advocate for simple rejection of these concepts and return to the basics, to the basic concept of sovereignty as it exists anywhere else in the world. I think that's the only solution for this country.
Thank you, dear professors. If you're okay with that, I would like to start with my set of questions for you. Then we can move on to the questions from the audience. My first question is for Professor Muhasilović. So you were talking about the lack of vision and lobbying currently in Bosnia, as well as the need for the establishment of national guidelines. So what would you say are the priorities for the domestic as well as the international decision makers for Bosnia? And another part of the question regarding the recent Schmitz interventions, what lessons should Bosnian citizens draw from the interventions that happened? What lessons should Bosnian citizens draw from the interventions?
We were having a discussion a few days ago with Zlatko related to this national pact, or however you want to call it. First, we have to detect whether there is a will to go in that direction. Because without will, there is no action. So first, we should recognize who are those people who are having legitimacy, to put it that way, or who are having authority in Bosnia. Just a few weeks ago, we had a all Bosniak assembly, something like that. But the politicians who were there were marginal politicians. So they were like from small local political parties. And I believe those people are not the representatives of either Bosnia or Bosniak, no matter how small their political party is. Because you have the fragmentation of the political scene here in Bosnia. You have political parties who are getting like a few thousand votes and they're entering the parliament. So I don't believe those people are representing Bosnia nor Bosniaks. So first thing, we have to detect who are those people who are going to carry that national pact. When we detect that, the next step would be to ask them whether they have will to do so. Because what we are facing here in Bosnia is lack of action, lack of interest, lack of will. I'm not generalizing, but that is the condition at the moment here. Because in order to have national strategy, someone have to back that, okay? I cannot write and I cannot represent a national strategy because I'm no one. But the people who are having power, they should support that idea with their political power, with their financial power. So that national pact should gather political elite, economic elite, academic elite. So all these people should be involved. It should not be a national pact of one single political party, of one single academic institution. It should be more wider, okay? More people should be included to that. And that would have some legitimacy if it is done that way. The next thing, before they start compiling national pact, is they should be on the same page, ideologically speaking. So they should be on the same, communists were calling that same ideological platform. So they should be on the same ideological, that ideological platform doesn't have to go into details. It can be general. It can be, you know, we are fighting for the territorial integrity of Bosnia, for the civic idea. We are fighting for the democracy, for Euro-Atlantic integrations, and set of rules that everyone should follow. Okay, no matter what the political orientation of a single leader is. And after that, it should be written by the academic community. I don't believe that it should be politicians who are writing this national pact. They should follow national pact, but they should not be ones who are writing it. Okay, so academic community should be involved in that. And it can be like very wide spectrum of people from different branches, from international relations, from political science, from law, faculties of law, from faculties of economy. So like very wide spectrum of people should be involved in writing that national pact. And of course, then implementation of that comes, and it should be implemented. Because when our pro-Bosnian politicians, when they are talking to Dodik, when they're talking to Čović, when they're talking to Vučić, Milanović, and all these guys, they don't have red lines. They don't know what those red lines are. They just repeat slogans, you know, territorial integrity, sovereignty of Bosnia, so on and so forth. Those are just slogans. But we don't know exactly on particular issue what our red line is. On the issue of borders, issue of energy, issue of mines, issue of financial system, we don't know what our red lines are, because no one wrote those red lines. And politicians, they don't know what kind of guidelines to follow. I mean, it's very, very, very deep subject. I mean, I don't want to take time, but that should be done as soon as possible. We don't have national pact, or national outlook, or national strategy, you call it. Lessons that our citizens should have related to Schmidt's interventions. Unfortunately, our citizens are big disappointment, as our politicians are big disappointment. Even bigger disappointment are the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They were not willing to fight for their own rights. Me, Reuf, and few guys from the room, Zlatko, we were on the protests when Schmidt, few guys here, I didn't name everyone. When Schmidt was implementing apartheid, we were there, and there were only few hundreds of citizens. And he was eliminating their rights of their kids. And they were not interested that day to come to protests. In thousands, they had to come in dozens of thousands. The citizens, they did not come. And I believe this nightmare that we are passing through is going to become even harsher down the road. Because that was the crucial day. If turnout was, I don't know, 80,000, 90,000 people, angry masses, in front of Ohair, this would not happen. He would not have a courage to impose apartheidic rules or to basically impose a government. He would not have courage. But when he saw that only few hundred people came to the protests, he saw that basically he can do whatever he wants. So citizens are a big disappointment here. And they're also responsible for what is going on. All those people who voted, and especially those people who didn't vote, and those people who didn't come to protest. They're responsible for what is going on. You know, it's very easy to point a finger to political party or to politician, but no, people are also responsible. They should not forget that. And I hope it's not too late. That's my hope. I don't believe that. I just hope that it's not too late. So that is the lesson that the citizens should get from the Schmidt's apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Next question is for the Professor Domi. You were talking about the negative implications caused by the electoral changes imposed by the Office of High Representative, and you were talking about the reaction from the international community. So I would like to ask you, do you know the reason why they took the stance that they did in this case? And how would you assess whether there is any kind of long-term plan for Office of High Representative and the political model in Bosnia currently?
the reaction. What was interesting to me about the reaction to the higher-ups' actions in October 22 on the evening of the election was the silence from the European Union. And there was reporting that indicated they're concerned. You know, behind the scenes, they're concerned, and they don't agree. Well, if you say that you're a representative of the European Union, like Mr. Sattler, and you uphold the values of the European Union, this would seem to be the moment to speak out in support of those values. Of course, I'm not a diplomat, although I know some things about being in diplomacy, and sometimes it's necessary to break some dishes. So, they didn't do it. They just chose not to do it. I can't explain it, you'd have to ask them. But the silence says everything to me about actually, I think, a lack of commitment to those values at a crucial moment where those values were completely abolished. And about the plans in the High Representative's office, I can suggest a plan. The first plan should be that Mr. Schmidt should be recalled to Berlin by the government in Berlin because he has not brought constructive actions to this country. He has created greater polarity because of his actions. And the big disappointment here for me wasn't that he did it, that's outrageous, but that the United States of America issued a statement in full support. So I don't know what the plans are, but the plan obviously was, there was an agreement made somewhere between Sarajevo, Zagreb, Washington to carry this out. And that's truly regrettable, especially for people like Jakob Finci, who's in this room, who put his faith and trust in the European Court of Human Rights. And there are 4 other decisions, and I hope that Avzor is going to be here to talk about that. Those decisions should be implemented, and they should be implemented now. And that's my recommendations as an outsider. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Just a short follow-up on the question. So, in recent days, there have been some speculations that in the European Union, there are discussions about the reduction of powers for the Office of High Representative. Do you think this is possible?
I think anything's possible. I think anything's possible.
But it's against the Constitution.
But I hear that. That doesn't mean that I agree with it. I'm just saying I think anything's possible. Look what they've already done. So I think we'll just have to wait and see. I think it's outrageous, the failure to uphold the Constitution of Bosnia that was drafted by the United States, their failure to treat this as a legacy that should be improved. It's very clear. I will say this right now. The Biden administration manages foreign policy. They don't initiate. They do what they absolutely have to do. You see it in Ukraine. I think that that ship has been righted most recently with the block by the congressional Republicans they finally had a breakthrough on the package. But I would say, and that I hear, and it is reported, that President Biden is daily involved in the situation in Israel, Gaza. He's daily involved in it. And so the time a president has to be used in the most judicious way. What are the priorities? And as previous speakers have suggested and said, that the Western Balkans are not a priority So anything could happen, including the diminishment of power. If they're actually talking about it, I can assure you there are conversations happening right now about which powers to probably diminish. Without knowing anything, I have no information.
Thank you, Professor. So the last question is for the Professor Hadžidević. So you were talking about the concept of sovereignty as well as the model that has been established in the Lisbon Conference. My question for you is, where does Bosnia go from here? How can, and whether there can be changes in this model, and how do we start?
Well, I think that I have already partly replied to your question by saying that we first have to go back to the principles, you know. Unless we really adopt the idea of sovereignty as it has been adopted anywhere else, then we cannot really go anywhere from here. But I want to specify one very practical path that we could use from this very moment on. The Dayton Agreement was adopted. It has never been verified or ratified. It was adopted through the so-called constitutional law of the 12th of December of 1995. The first article says that Bosnia-Herzegovina can change its constitutional structure by an international or via or through, I don't know what's the proper word for that, international agreement. And then in the second article, the law says that if this agreement is not fully implemented, the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina preserves the right to go back to the so-called status quo ante, to the previous state of affairs, to the Constitution of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Legally speaking, we should do that. We must do that, actually, because the Constitution, as it is, the Dayton Constitution, has been violated so many times, including the one by, not one, two, two violations by Christian Schmidt, then so many violations by Milorad Dodik and some others too. But I would first put Christian Schmidt, who was supposed to implement and control the implementation of the Dayton Peace Agreement and the Dayton Constitution and so on. And he was the one to actually violate it, to practically destroy the very sense of constitutionality, if you like. So the first practical step which our parliament must do, I cannot say should do because it is a must. They are obliged to do that. They adopted the law in 95 through which they changed the constitutional structure. Now they are obliged to respect the Article 2, which says that in case of non-implementation or misimplementation, or call it whatever you like, of the Dayton Constitution and Dayton Peace Agreement, the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Bosnia-Herzegovina is the successor of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The current parliament is the successor of the parliament of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, preserves the right to go back to the constitution of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's a must. If you ask me, it's a must. Legally speaking, that's the state of affairs.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you once again for your fruitful discussion and insights. We are slowly coming closer to the end of the second panel. I would like to invite audience, now it's your time. If you have any questions, please. Yes?
On that dimension. Thank you. Anyone who wants to take a panelist, because it's a broad question, so whoever wants to be involved.
I can't conjecture what the target was. I mean, Dan Serwer talked earlier about during the war not wanting, you know, the war effort in central Bosnia was being advanced by the Bosnian army, and the Washington Agreement emerged in '94, and so they joined forces with Croatia. And that, I think likely that maybe a majority Bosniaks is considered a threat. But I haven't been in rooms where that was discussed, and I'm not privy to those discussions, but that wouldn't surprise me because I think that's Europe writ large. And I think there's a lot of concern about Islam in Europe, which is regrettable in the fact is that people become radicalized by oppression, and this was just so heavy-handed, what took place. There's definitely a motivation to sideline SDA, but I'm not privy, I don't know. It's just an observation.
Sorry. Thank you. So there are a few dimensions of that story. So your question was, why would they allow Croatia to have the control over the federation? Well, one level of that is based on Croatia's national interest, and other one is based on geopolitics. So one which is related to Croatia, Croatia needs something which is called in literature strategic depth. Because of the shape of the Croatia, it is very unnatural, and Croatia is on few places in Dalmatia, like between the sea and Bosnia, there is only a few kilometers, and from the strategic point of view, that is very hard to defend. It's impossible to bring in any potential war. You cannot bring army from Zagreb to defend Dubrovnik. You would be invaded, and will be probably late for a few weeks. So that is first dimension of the story, I believe, strategic depth for Croatia. Because Croatia, if Bosnian Croats would see that reality, Zagreb is constantly using them only as a buffer and as a strategic depth. So they are seeing Bosnian Croats who are along the Bosnia-Croatia border as only as a buffer towards the Bosniaks and towards the Serbs. So they use them for their political and geopolitical reasons. Other thing is, I believe there are some forces in the West who like the role that Croatia potentially is going to play, and that is to control Bosniaks. To control Bosniaks, it is enough to control the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because probably more than 90% of Bosniaks are living there, right? So we have minority of Bosniaks in Republika Srpska, and that is Belgrade's task, to control those Bosniaks. Why Bosniaks should be controlled? Well, it is, I believe, very simple, and Tanya has mentioned that. It's not a problem to have, someone would say, okay, when you put that Muslims in Europe theory, someone would say, okay, there is 60 million Muslims in Europe, so what's wrong with that? Yes, but they're minority. They're minority. Muslims with the state, that's a problem, okay? It's not a problem to have 60 million Muslims, but it's a problem to have 2 million Muslims with state, which means Muslims with state would have armed forces, they would have diplomacy, they would have foreign policy, they would have their military industry, so on and so forth. Other countries, other Muslim majority countries could project their power from that Muslim majority state in Europe, towards those diaspora communities, okay? So that's a problem. So that's why I believe they're using Belgrade and Zagreb for that task. It's not that Zagreb and Belgrade are so important, but they're using them for that task. Otherwise, you would have to have European army here stationed or US army stationed here. And Zlatko is right. Dayton only confirmed ethnic division. It did not start with the Dayton, it only confirmed and has frozen that ethnic division. So that idea that the Bosnia should be divided ethnically for eternity was always present in
Western circles, even from the beginning, even from the days of referendum for independence. And what Dayton has done is only has frozen that situation, and basically awarded separatist forces by putting them on the same table with the legitimate Bosnian army and the legitimate Bosnian state, Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Shortly. Yeah.
I might add, I absolutely agree with you, and you can see the reaction, and there are people in this room that are much smarter than me about it, but you can see the reaction to how Europe responds to Turkey and how they manage Turkey, and Turkey being a NATO member is an example of it, you know, high power, Muslim-dominated country, and how do they keep them in check? So they've not clearly advanced in EU enlargement, as an example. I'll leave my comments.
Mr. Finzi, I believe you, I'm sorry, yes.
I just wanted, I was going to, quick comments. I'm a former OHR employee. Please don't throw anything at me. But you need to be aware when you talk about Christian Schmidt and why did Christian Schmidt do what he did, etc. Americans fully orchestrated INSCO's removal, the replacement with Christian Schmidt, specifically because INSCO would not do their bidding in terms of the electoral law. And they had to find someone through Merkel who would. And as long as Christian Schmidt is ready to do what the Americans want, OHR will be around. It is, the direction is, I think, eventual closure of the OHR, so you may have a point. And just shortly to say, whether I highly doubt, knowing what I know about the EU here, I highly doubt that the EU was opposed to those decisions, probably within the PIC steering board. Some EU countries, the Netherlands for sure, Spain maybe, might have been opposed, but the EU as an institution opposed, doubtful.
Yes, any other comments, questions? Yes, please.
Okay, it's me again, and I'll try to be brief and a bit not so enigmatic. When listening this panel and hearing what has been said, it reminded me so much on a scene from movie Goodfellas, when Henry Hill and played by Ray Liotta and Robert De Niro sit in a diner, and when Henry Hill narrates over the scene, what does it mean to have Tommy included in the mob, saying that he and Jimmy will never be a part of the family because they have Irish blood, and nobody cares that Henry Hill's mom is part Sicilian, and how they had high hopes of being a part of the family and pushing their own interests. And to cut the long story short, the scene ends not in the way how they hoped. Tommy was assassinated, and Jimmy threw down the phone booth. So, in order to put it in the present context, is there some kind of glass ceiling up to where you can advance? Or can you always be a wise guy, never a good fella? Thank you.
I'd just like to add, that scene actually, when they were going around the table, most of the mob bosses were saying, yes, Tommy's a great guy. But one of them said, the oldest mob boss said, why take the risk? And that is the crucial part of the scene. That was in the casino.
Okay, that's some movie discussion.
Yeah,
The
we should
point
wrap
is,
it up.
Why take the risk?
Good afternoon. My short definition about Bosnia is that Bosnia is one state with two entities, three constituent people, 4 traditional religions, and 100 of problems, at least 100 of problems. And even 25 very wise people sitting in this room hardly can find answer even in one of these 100 problems that we have. And now we are discussing a lot about American policy in Bosnia, and the title of this session is about the Biden administration in Bosnia. And nobody is speaking about answer to this. Is there any chance that Bosnia will start to answer with one voice? Because on each and every question, especially on the international field, we have at least 3 answers. And these 3 answers are not even close to each other. And that's one of the problems. Who will listen us? And the question is, which one you will listen? Naturally, this is complicated. Somebody mentioned now very famous Sejdić-Finci case, which is almost, now it will be in December, 15 years old. Problem is that it's not solved, and it's very simple comparing with some other decisions of European Court of Human Rights concerning Bosnia. Bosnia is naturally complicated. Reading our constitution, the first sentence said, as you quoted, Bosnia consists of constituent people, Bosniak, Serbs, Croats, citizens, and others. Obviously, I'm not Bosnian, Serb, or Croat. I'm citizen or others. What I am? I don't know, but maybe one day somebody will tell me this is a huge secret. I discussed when this case, before I started this case, I discussed this with Dick Holbrook. It was the 10th anniversary of the Dayton in 2005 in Dayton, and after that, Washington, D.C. And I asked him, what was your idea? How we can build the country, the democracy on this way? To divide everything on 3. And he said, my dear, this was not decision made against you. But this was the first thing that 3 negotiators agree immediately, to divide everything on 3. Regardless how many people we have with one of belonging to one, second or third religion or nationality, or ask it, call it as you want. At the same time, these days, we are losing citizens. I think that in Bosnia, we have at least 2 times more passports than total citizens. There is no Bosnian with only 1 passport. Or if he has only 1 passport, everyone will say, look this crazy guy, he has only Bosnian passport. According to the statement of Jahja Muhasilović was head of staff of Dragan Čović. Then she became Bosnian ambassador first to France, then to Italy, to Spain, and at the end of the day, she is now for the 2nd time elected as a Croatian representative to the European Parliament. She said on our television, Croatia supports Bosnia a lot. We gave more than 1 million passports to Bosnians. She said this on Face television, and anchorman of Face television said, is this possible? Are these passports still valid? And she said, yes, they are each 5 years, they are prolonged for next 5 years. So my simple question is, can these 25 wise people find the answer how Bosnia can speak with one voice, which will be accepted at least for 2/3 of Bosnia? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe one of the panelists can give a short comment or not, because we are running out of time. Okay, that's it, I guess, or?
I didn't hear his question.
Could you repeat the question, sorry? Do you have any question for the panelists?
How we can achieve that Bosnia is speaking with one voice? Not 100% of population, but at least 2/3.
One short comment so we can conclude with that.
If I may.
Yeah.
So I'd like to try to respond to this question. I think that it's very simple. We need a new constitution, and we need new categories in that constitution. We are thinking in, that's what I try to warn about, we are thinking in totally messed up categories which don't exist anywhere else in the world, and we just have to simply rewrite any constitution in Europe or the US Constitution and have one voice. That's how we can make it. As simple as that. Because at the Lisbon Conference, and it was verified later in Dayton, we got this monster made up of 3 voices, and I forgot to say we had a brief debate who actually introduced land swaps. It was introduced at the Lisbon Conference, of course. Not before that, not after that, not Mogherini or whoever, but it was Lord Carrington. Land swaps as the principle which exists in Bosnia still, they were introduced at the Lisbon Conference, and we still think in these categories. Who is going to live in which territory? I would like to remind all the people here who were in Bosnia back in 91 or even 90. All of a sudden in this country, we were surrounded, we were diving in millions of maps, so-called ethnic maps. No one ever posed the question who printed those maps, who spread it among the population of this country. But ever since, people started thinking in these categories, how to put themselves under which color. Red for Serbs, blue for Croats, green for Muslims. No one has ever asked about this intelligence operation, who actually launched it, who spread all those maps, and why that was done. Obviously, that was done in purpose prior to the Lisbon Conference. And ever since, people are thinking in these categories, how to put themselves under this or that color, on this or that territory. That's something which simply cannot support a single state. That's something which automatically dissolves a state into 3. It is something which doesn't exist, as I said many times, anywhere else in the world. And we have to finally reject all these categories in order to speak with a single voice. If we don't want to adopt a new constitution or write a new constitution, we can go back to the constitution of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, or we can rewrite any foreign constitution. We just need to abandon all these categories for good. And that's the only solution.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, panelists, guests. This is the end of the second panel. Now it's a short break, then we will continue with the third one. Thank you.